Every day, Santiago woke up before the sun to make breakfast for little Lupita. He always tried to give her something nice, even though, deep down, he knew he needed to save every penny. Being a single dad was never easy, but Santiago had a strength that didn't let anyone see his weaknesses, especially not his daughter. That day, he was more tired than usual, but he grabbed Lupita's backpack, fixed her hair like he always did, and they both left for the daycare. Daycare was a relief for Santiago. There he knew Lupita was well cared for while he worked, but the cost was becoming a huge burden. Every month he had to struggle to gather the money, sometimes even giving up on buying essential things for himself. The pressure was constant, but what really hurt was the insecurity of not knowing if he could keep providing it for her. While he held Lupita's little hand, he felt a mix of pride and guilt. Pride for everything he had managed to do, for fighting every day, but guilt because no matter how hard he tried, it always seemed like it wasn't enough. Carmen had always been a firm but fair boss. She trusted Santiago's work and noticed how dedicated he was every day. He wasn't just another employee. Santiago was someone who always did his best, always attentive and willing to help. Carmen knew he was a single dad and understood how much he tried to give Lupita a decent life, even though he never openly talked about his struggles. This respect she showed him day to day gave Santiago some peace, because he knew that, as long as he was doing the right thing, his job was safe. But as the days passed, Santiago couldn't get a worry out of his mind. The cost of Lupita's daycare was rising, and he was already stretched to the limit trying to cover expenses. He knew he needed to ask for a raise. Any extra help would make a big difference. But even so, he hesitated. After all, he was still new on the team and didn't want to give the wrong impression. Will they think I'm unhappy? What if they think I'm asking for too much? He wondered nervously. The last thing Santiago wanted was to put his position at risk, especially now, with bills piling up more and more. To make things a bit more complicated, he noticed a quiet tension between Pablo, Carmen's husband, and Doña Elena, her mother. Doña Elena had always been a strong-minded woman, and Santiago sensed that she didn't fully trust Pablo. There was something in her looks and subtle comments that made her discomfort clear. She often questioned Pablo's intentions, sometimes even openly, and seemed to always be watching as if expecting him to slip up. Santiago didn't get involved, but he knew that in this tense and pressured environment, he had to act very carefully to avoid getting caught up in a conflict that wasn't his. That afternoon, Mrs. Elena decided to visit Carmen and Pablo's house in Polanco. She always liked to stay close, to keep an eye on her daughter's life. Although she never openly admitted it, something about Pablo bothered her, a persistent feeling that made her question her son-in-law's intentions. After spending a few hours at Carmen's house, she decided to go for a walk, breathing deeply as she thought about how she might protect her daughter from possible heartache. Then, in the middle of the afternoon, Mrs. Elena decided to stop for lunch at La Casa de Toño restaurant. As soon as she walked in, something caught her eye. At a table a little way off was Pablo, talking with a woman Mrs. Elena didn't know. They seemed deeply involved in a private conversation, and the closeness between them made her frown. She stood there for a moment, unsure if she could believe what she was seeing. Could Pablo be betraying Carmen? That unsettling scene stirred something inside her, a mix of worry and distrust. Driven by curiosity and a bit by the instinct to protect Carmen, Mrs. Elena decided to follow them. With her camera in her bag, she discreetly started taking photos of the meeting, trying to gather any evidence she might use if her suspicion turned out to be true. She followed them for several blocks at a safe distance, observing the gestures and exchanges of glances between Pablo and the woman. With each photo, her heart raced more. She didn't know if she wanted it to be true or if deep down she hoped it was all just a misunderstanding. Following them up to the hills of Chapultepec, Mrs. Elena began to feel tired. Her legs weren't as steady as before, but she kept going. At one point, rushing to keep them in sight, she took a wrong step and twisted her ankle. The pain was immediate and intense. She looked around and realized she was alone, far from the city's bustle. Unable to walk, she was overcome with desperation. She tried calling for help, but no one seemed to hear her. Then, among the trees, she saw Santiago walking with Lupita. He quickly noticed what was happening and ran to help. Mrs. Elena, still in pain and visibly shaken, accepted Santiago's support, clutching his arm as he helped her up. Without understanding why she was there, Santiago didn't ask questions. He just offered his help. Lupita looked at Mrs. Elena with concern, and that small moment of support turned into an unexpected relief for her. who, even filled with doubts and pain, had no choice but to trust this man who, deep down, only wanted the best for her daughter, just as she did. Santiago moved closer to Mrs. Elena and, without a second thought, offered his support to help her stand up. He didn't know her, but he could see she was in difficulty and clearly upset. As he held her, Mrs. Elena gripped his arm with unexpected strength and, between sighs and cries of pain, began to explain what had happened. "Listen closely, young man," she said urgently and breathlessly. She pointed to the camera she carried, and Santiago, not understanding the reason for her urgency, listened carefully. "Inside this camera, there's something my daughter needs to see, something she can't ignore, something about her husband." He felt the seriousness in her words, and the weight of that request caught him by surprise. The camera looked so ordinary, but Mrs. Elena held it as if it were a treasure, or perhaps a bomb. "I need you to take this to Carmen," she continued. "She's your boss, right?" Santiago nodded, still processing the whole situation. "All right. These photos reveal something she needs to know. Don't let anything or anyone stop you, and for the sake of what you love most in life, don't let this camera fall into the wrong hands." She looked at Santiago with an intensity that made him feel, for a moment, that he had a huge responsibility. No matter how confusing the situation was, he knew he couldn't ignore her request. With the camera in his hands, he nodded and promised to do as she asked. He didn't fully understand what was going on, but he knew there was something important here. As he helped Mrs. Elena get comfortable, he looked at Lupita and felt that somehow this mission was something he needed to do, maybe not just to protect Carmen, but also for his own daughter, who might one day need the same courage and determination he needed to show now. When Santiago got home that night, Donna Elena's camera was still firmly in his hands. He knew there was something important there, but his heart was torn. Even though Donna Elena had been clear about the urgency, Santiago hesitated to get involved in what seemed like a personal and delicate matter. He didn't want to cause trouble, but at the same time he felt a sense of responsibility, especially after seeing Donna Elena's serious expression and hearing her say how Carmen needed to see those images. After much thought, he decided to check the photos to understand exactly what Donna Elena wanted him to reveal. When he turned on the camera and started viewing the images, a heavy feeling took over him. There were Pablo and an unknown woman sitting together, leaning towards each other in ways that left little doubt. Each photo seemed closer, more intimate. Santiago sighed, feeling a tightness in his chest. He found himself in the middle of something he didn't want, and he knew that if he handed those images to Carmen, the pain it might cause would be immense. But at the same time, he knew that hiding the truth would also make him complicit in something that didn't feel right. In the following days, Santiago was still trying to gather the courage to talk to Carmen, but unexpectedly, Pablo appeared at work and asked him for a private conversation. Pablo's manner was different, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and a tone that made Santiago feel small. "I heard you have a camera that belongs to my mother-in-law," Pablo started in a threatening way. Santiago tried to stay calm, but his heart was racing. Pablo stepped closer and, in a cold tone, whispered something that froze Santiago inside. "It would be a shame if something happened to your daughter, wouldn't it? Lupita, that's her name, right?" Santiago felt his blood run cold. He held his breath as Pablo continued. "It would be better if those photos disappeared, Santiago. Much better for you and for your daughter." The threat was clear, and suddenly Santiago's moral dilemma had turned into something much bigger and more dangerous. With a heavy heart and fear growing inside him, Santiago realized that now not only was his integrity at stake, but also his daughter's safety. Santiago stayed awake all night, replaying Pablo's words in his head and wondering what to do. He looked at Lupita, sleeping peacefully beside him, and fear grew in his chest. She was his daughter, his little one, and he would do anything to protect her. But at the same time, he knew that keeping this secret meant leaving Carmen in the dark, not knowing the kind of man who was by her side. He felt trapped, torn between his loyalty to the truth and the unconditional love he felt for his daughter. The days passed slowly, and Santiago tried to avoid contact with Pablo, staying constantly on guard. But the tension was in the air, and he knew that sooner or later, everything would come out. Then, one day, unexpectedly, Carmen returned from a trip to Monterrey earlier than expected. Santiago was surprised when he received a message asking him to come to her house that night, and nervousness filled him. It felt like something was about to happen. When he arrived, he found Carmen in the living room with Donna Elena, and to his surprise, Pablo was also there. The tension was thick, and Santiago could sense that Carmen already knew something was wrong. Donna Elena, with her steady gaze, gave Santiago a look of support, as if telling him he should go ahead. Carmen approached him, confused, but with an expression that clearly showed she wanted answers. That's when Pablo, maybe sensing he was cornered, tried to downplay the situation, moving closer to Carmen and trying to convince her that it was all a misunderstanding. But Santiago knew he could no longer hold back. With a trembling but determined voice, he handed the camera to Carmen, explaining that there was something there she needed to see. Santiago took a deep breath and with trembling hands began showing the photos to Carmen. With each picture, her face changed, first with surprise, then disbelief, until finally, shock turned into deep sadness. Carmen could barely believe what she was seeing. The images showed Pablo and that unknown woman, too close to be just friends or colleagues. The intimate scenes captured left no room for excuses. While Carmen was still trying to process it, Donna Elena came closer, touching her daughter's shoulder firmly with a serious look. "I've suspected for some time, Carmen," she said, her voice choked but full of resolve. "This isn't just about this affair. Pablo has been taking advantage of your trust in many ways." Santiago stayed silent, feeling the weight of Donna Elena's words. She went further, revealing that she had found proof Pablo was diverting funds from the company, using Carmen's money to fund his own interests while leading a double life. Carmen looked at her mother, unable to hide the mix of pain and betrayal. Santiago felt his heart tighten, knowing that at that moment, Carmen was losing not just a husband, but also trust in someone who shared her life, and he, as strange as it felt, sensed he had fulfilled a hard but necessary role in her life. Donna Elena, still looking firmly at Carmen, reinforced, "You needed to know this, my dear. It was time you saw who he really is." And Santiago, without saying anything, just wished that this painful moment would somehow become a turning point in Carmen's life, so she could find the strength to move forward. When Pablo realized his lies were exposed, his expression changed from arrogance to despair. He quickly stepped back, saying this was all a setup, and that no one there had the right to accuse him without solid evidence. But deep down, he knew he was cornered. With a sudden movement, he tried to leave the house, clearly determined to escape facing the consequences. What he didn't know was that Santiago, just minutes earlier, had made a quick and discreet call to the police. He knew that if he let Pablo leave, it might be hard to ensure justice and safety for Carmen and everyone Pablo had deceived. As soon as Pablo stepped outside, he heard the sound of sirens. In seconds, the police intercepted him, and despite his attempts to break free, he ended up restrained. Inside the house, Carmen watched the scene through the window with an expression of deep pain. Seeing Pablo taken away in handcuffs brought a mix of relief and sadness. This was the man with whom she had planned a life, someone she had trusted with an open heart, and now everything felt like a cruel lie. She felt tears fill her eyes, but she held firm. With a calm, though painful resolve, she turned to Santiago and her mother and made a final choice. "It's over," she said, her voice shaky but filled with determination. Carmen knew she needed to cut all ties with Pablo to move forward, to rebuild her life free of lies and manipulation. She didn't want to carry anything from a relationship that now only brought wounds. It was time to start over, to leave behind the person Pablo pretended to be, and though hurt, Carmen felt stronger in making that decision. After everything that had happened, Santiago continued his work at the company, now with a renewed sense of peace. Carmen, even amid the pain of betrayal, was determined to reward him for his loyalty and courage during such a delicate moment. He had never sought attention, but her respect and gratitude were clear. A few days later, Santiago was called to her office, where Carmen, with a serious and grateful look, announced his promotion and gave him a raise, along with a bonus he never expected. To him, it was more than financial recognition. It was proof that honesty and character are always worthwhile. Meanwhile, Pablo continued to face the consequences of his actions. He was in prison, but the defeat seemed worse than any cell. He could barely accept that everything he had built had crumbled so quickly. Anger and resentment burned inside him, as if he couldn't bear the thought that Santiago, someone he considered insignificant, had the courage to confront him. He refused to accept failure, and somehow his arrogance blinded him to the reality of his own choices. For Santiago, however, that chapter seemed finally closed. He was ready to move on, with more confidence to care for Lupita, and the peace of knowing that despite all the challenges, he had done the right thing. After so many days of worry and tension, Doña Elena finally felt a peace she hadn't known in a long time. Seeing Pablo pay for everything he had done brought her deep relief. She knew her daughter was now safe and free from a relationship built on lies. Inside, Doña Elena felt calm, knowing she had trusted her intuition and fought to protect Carmen, even though the path had been difficult and filled with uncertainty. Knowing that the truth had come out was all she needed. For Carmen, the pain was still there, but each day felt like a step forward. She began surrounding herself with things and people that made her feel good, trying to find the path she had lost. Her gratitude for Santiago and her mother was immense. They had shown her what she needed to see, even though it was painful. She understood that without their courage, she might still be trapped in a life of lies. Gradually, with their help, she started to rebuild her life with renewed strength, feeling that for the first time in a long time, she was on the right path to true happiness. With the new job and a more stable income, Santiago finally felt he could breathe easier. For the first time, he knew he wouldn't need to worry so much about Lupita's nursery fees or the bills that used to keep him up at night. He looked at his daughter with immense pride, knowing that everything he had done, every sacrifice and hard choice, was for her. Now the mornings felt different. He could take Lupita out without that heavy feeling in his chest, without the constant anxiety from before. Santiago started to think about all the things he could now offer her, the toys she always looked at in the shops, and maybe even a small trip one day. Something simple, but a dream he had to show her a bit more of the world. He felt grateful for the hard road that had led him here, for the challenges and, of course, for the people who believed in him and supported him. He knew there would still be difficult days, but now, with a bit more stability, he felt he could give Lupita the happy, peaceful childhood she deserved.